いかがですか、渡辺ダンです。On today's episode of Hollywood Rants, Tales from the North Hollywood Curmudgeon, we're going to be discussing the state of the entertainment industry as of the end of August 2021. So let's begin with what's going on in the world of the COVID pandemic and Delta 19. Fortunately, production has not been shut down. It is still ongoing, and that's a very big positive. One of the benefits of the entire period of COVID is that the entertainment industry has shown once again that it is able to adapt to absolutely anything, including something as severe as a pandemic, which means that you cannot even have the crew on the set at the same time as your principals. This has led to a process known as podding, where you will have the A team come in last. First of all, you'll have the design teams, then you'll have the lighting team and the camera team come in. And after everyone is set up and between each setup, there's a period of disinfecting as much as humanly possible. Then you bring in the actors because they are generally performing in an environment where they cannot be masked or face shielded or any of the other stuff. So the industry has done a very good job of learning how to manage it. And in fact, has created certain efficiencies surrounding this particular challenge. And yay for the entertainment industry, showing that it is ahead of the curve in being able to figure things out. So the other thing that has happened is that to a large degree, much of the work job is now done remotely. Now, this is changing and more people are coming back to the office, but it's not on a 100% basis. So there's still especially in LA, benefit of not having massive traffic. And let's keep hoping that it stays this way. I don't have any hope that it will, but hey, we can always dream, right? But even then, you have the opportunity to use Zoom. Now, I know that people have been making jokes about the Brady Bunch and all of that being the precursor to it. But the fact is that you can now have international conversations very easily. You can now have conversations across the country very easily. This also means to a certain degree, and this might not be so great for a lot of people in LA, that certain people have decided that they're going to work remotely from now on, especially if they're in the post-production side of the business or they're in the marketing, where you don't necessarily need to be in the office every single day. Plus, and let's be honest about this, when you're working from home, even though you can get distracted by the dog and the kids and everything else, including the unfolded laundry, it does make it easier to get work done because you don't have the constant interruptions. There are still certain challenges regarding insurance, as well as what happens to people who, for one reason or another, are not eligible for getting the vaccine. But all of this is being worked through. And unfortunately, the way a lot of things are reported is always in the most melodramatic and, shall we say, not necessarily truthful manner, because journalism is always, if it bleeds, it leads. What's happened in the digital age is if it bleeds, it leads, has moved into every aspect of journalism. Anyway, let's now talk about one of the big things that's impacting the industry, and for me as an instructor in film, is one of the most difficult things to talk about, because I'm always talking to students who are interested in being above the line or being creatives. And the truth is that one of the challenges of the entertainment industry is that it is made up of two words: show business. And as one of my former bosses used to say, Tony Scotti, I don't know where he got it from, but it's absolutely correct. The problem with show business is people will obsess over one of the words and screw up the other. And we've seen prime examples of both being exhibited, especially over the past 10 to 15 years. In fact, it's gotten to be very, very polarizing that you have so many creative decisions based exclusively on coming up with a good business deal. But let's face it, you can't shoot a business deal. And to even attempt to think that the business side trumps the creative in terms of making a good picture or TV series is quixotic at best and totally irresponsible at worst. On the other hand, you will have, especially through Netflix and some of the streaming services, which had so much venture capital pouring in, that responsibility was not even considered, to the point where vast sums of money were being spent on artistic endeavors which had no hope of getting their money back. Perhaps the prime examples of that are things like Mank and The Irishman. The Irishman in particular cost $175 million, which in terms of the traditional theatrical market meant that you were expecting to make along the lines of 800 million to $1 billion, which, and you know I love Martin Scorsese, was a pipe dream. You've got to ask, what are you smoking? Because I'd like some of that too, because it had no relationship to what could possibly happen. Yes, it did prove that Netflix was indeed a big player, but it was playing a very dangerous game. This is the same game that Carolco played in the late 80s through the early 90s, when it started spending incredible sums of money to get big talent. And certainly it did put itself on the map that way. But despite the fact it had Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct and Total Recall and other huge smash films, it was out of business by 1994. The same goes true for Orion, which won Best Picture for Dances with Wolves, and the next year for Silence of the Lambs, and was gone 2 years after. So you need to watch the fiscal house and not get too caught up in that kind of craziness. And speaking of that, let's talk about two studios that have gone through the process of being part of mergers and acquisitions in a big way, and what the consequences of that was. The first of those two studios we'll look at, because it clearly didn't work, is Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers was bought by AT&T for the princely sum of $85 billion, which was $15 billion more than Disney overpaid for Fox. And in the process of doing that, they acquired something that they thought was going to augment their own ability to have platforms, cable, streaming, and all of that, very, very well. Now, that deal was taking place during the halcyon period when The Joker was an international hit. And at the same time, you were entering the final seasons of Game of Thrones. So it looked like everything that Warner Brothers was doing was going in the right direction. You had every side of the company seeming to be highly profitable. Plus, there was the promise of what streaming would bring. And remember, at this time, Netflix was dominant. In fact, it was the only game in town. But Disney Plus, Warner, and HBO Max, and all the others were soon coming online. And there was this assumption, which in hindsight, which is always 2020, was absolutely ridiculous, that every one of these other companies was going to be able to have the same sort of revenue stream that Netflix would have, that you would have consumers buying everything rather than cherry picking, having a service for X amount of time and then switching to another service when you happen to be bored with this. Well, now let's flash forward a mere 2 years later. Warner Brothers gets dumped by AT&T to the point where Discovery Media buys it. Now, for those who are on the outside of Hollywood and perhaps on Wall Street, which was maybe who this was targeted at, this made it look like big mergers were happening and that you were having a return to the days of the old RJR Nabisco merger, where you have a smaller company taking over a larger one and its stock rising to the heavens. Well, we all remember what happened with that, the Barbarians at the Gate era. Yes, it crashed. And to be honest, and this is my opinion, when Discovery bought Warner Brothers, there's a reason for that, because AT&T, in effect, took a $45 billion write-down. Now, they say, well, they own 80% of whatever the profits are from this new merger. Come on, what profits are there going to be? Let's face it, the reason AT&T needed to sell Warner Brothers is they took a look at their books circa 2020 and said, oh my God, what have we bought? We have bought a disaster. And the fact that there's been somewhat of a bloodbath, but not nearly as big as I think is still in the pipeline to happen, is indicative of just how bad things were. Remember what happened during the period between the time the deal became an inevitability and the time it actually closed. What did Warner Brothers do? They released Birds of Prey, which, let's just say, was a disappointment. And let's just say the Warner Brothers marketing brass and their executive ranks did not do themselves any favors by joining what has become a very strange proclivity within entertainment today. And that is to mock your audience or to blame your audience for being rubes when your movie isn't a hit. Can we say that's idiotic? I mean, your audience needs to be as large as possible, and saying the reason your movie's a failure is because your audience are a bunch of ignorant idiots is not going to help increase that number. But for some reason, that seems to be the coin of the realm throughout so much of the entertainment industry today, which is to blame the audience for your own inability to maximize it. And to call your audience racist, sexist, KKK members is a phenomenal error. Because when you have a business, no matter what your revenues are temporarily from outside of your shores, to assume that you can alienate your home base is to court eventual disaster. And sure enough, that's what's happening. Because look at what's happened since then. Not only did Birds of Prey fail, but so did Wonder Woman 84. Now, this was a highly anticipated sequel, and it was marketed on the strength of Patty Jenkins being the director and it being a movie for women. Can we say, what are you thinking? What part of your marketing team is asleep at the wheel? It's great if a film crosses over from its core audience into an expansion audience. But comic book heroes and all of that are very much the realm of males, predominantly white males, although it is overrepresented demographically in each of the individual segments. So you have a very strong audience there, and you have a secondary audience of females who enjoy this too. But to say that you're going to switch the audience from predominantly male to predominantly female because females outnumber males demographically is, again, something that you got to sit on the psychiatric couch for a minute, because that's not going to happen. You can say it's going to happen, and you can do press releases saying it's going to happen. But the truth is, if you actually, in your heart of heart meetings, when you're sitting there crunching the numbers, you better not think that, because it isn't going to happen. You have to blossom where you're planted. And if you're making a movie for a certain demographic, that's the demographic you have. It's not going to change, no matter how much you might want it to, and no matter how much press releases you put out there, and no matter how much the media backs you up on it. It ain't gonna happen. And that's what happened here. is that it was an alienation of the core without bringing in the secondary. So now you're having a disaster in one of their prime properties. This is backed up by what happened with Batwoman and Supergirl, two series that were anticipated to be enormous hits and ended up being, at the very least, disappointments and at worst, complete humiliations. This was also problematic in terms of Games of Thrones. Now everyone expected the last season of Game of Thrones could never live up to whatever expectation an audience would have. But I don't think many people anticipated exactly how off the rails that the last season would be. Clearly, you had you had a series that had a story arc that would have been appropriate to be played out over 2 or 3 seasons. But rather than saying, hey, you know what, we got a really prime asset here. We got an asset that we have almost $1 billion investment in. We better not mess this up. Instead of saying that, everyone was so focused on the merger and making sure that the numbers could work out that rather than setting up deals that would ensure that happening, they allowed the series to run right over the cliff. And I actually believe that there were a lot of people who thought, okay, yeah, it might be a disappointment, but who cares? We've got sequels coming, we got prequels coming, we have so much in merchandise coming that it doesn't matter if we mess up our final season. Those are famous last thoughts. And those are the thoughts that only someone who's got a Harvard MBA could care less about the entertainment industry, will not look at the past because everything's an eternal present, because that's what Twitter says, that there wasn't any common sense deployed. And what did it do? It ruined the title to the point where a $30 million pilot, which is an absolutely irresponsible amount to be paid for something that's not a sure thing, was eaten. They didn't move forward with it. Now today we're hearing they're going to do other prequels to it, but let's face it, the Game of Thrones name is now toxic. It's going to take a heck of a lot of a reboot to turn that ship around. I'm not saying it can't happen. After all, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a fairly disastrous movie that was later turned into a successful series. So, okay, miracles can happen, but that is not normative. It's not normative to take something that you've run over the cliff and turn it around into something that can be rebooted. We're going to see the same thing happen, I think, with the Sopranos prequel. Now, we all know that the Sopranos last episode caused a lot of controversy to the point where projected future feature films didn't happen. And in the interim, James Gandolfini died in real life. Now, of course, there was always theories that he's killed at the end of The Sopranos. And I'm going to say, yeah, most likely, if you watch the show and you really pay attention to it, yeah, that's the general hint. But it ain't underlying. So by having an unsatisfactory ending, they killed that franchise. And the same thing happened with Game of Thrones. There's all sorts of reasons why that went off the rails. One of which is that the writing team had signed a deal with Disney, which for Star Wars, which once they got a look at what they did with the last season of Game of Thrones, said, okay, that deal is canceled. So it's been a disaster for absolutely everyone, especially because once Watchmen, which was supposed to be the temporary replacement for Game of Thrones, failed as well. Emmys notwithstanding. So you have now Game of Thrones, and which is all of HBO, and the DC universe going from being things that looked very, very positive to being less so. And then we get into what about their TV investments? What about their cable investments? What about their streaming? Well, in the interim between the time the deal closed and the present, we've seen that their streaming service has been a disappointment. Now, if you look at the publicity that Variety publishes, which is a press release that's been completely uncritically republished, pretty much verbatim, you're hearing about how, oh, they're ahead of expectation and all that. The bottom line is, no, they're not. They're still not anywhere near on an upward trajectory overall. They're still very much stuck at a certain level. And despite the fact that they're running feature films day and date with their theatrical releases under the excuse that, well, COVID is making us do this, it's still very, very problematic, because the number of new subscribers they're getting is not making up for the fact that they're crippling their theatrical release. And so let's do another quick aside here. What is it about theatrical right now? Can it recover? The quick answer to that is it better, because so much money is being spent on intellectual property right now. If there is no theatrical window, then absolutely everything is a paid for piece of content that is sitting in a warehouse of content. How do you find it? The truth is, unless it's among the biggest pieces of content, you don't. So that's putting a lot of the industry at a very uncomfortable position, because money is being spent as if there will be massive hits. Because remember, when you release something theatrically, you run the risk of having financial ruin, but you also have the upside of having an out-of-the-box hit, which makes so much more than any projection, that you can fund a whole slate of other movies and TV shows just based on that over revenue that you got from one title. So when you have something outperform theatrically, because it's definite money in your pocket right away, you have something that then drives all of the ancillaries afterwards. And in order to have that work, you need to have a period where it's in theaters exclusively. And we saw that happen recently with the most recent Ryan Reynolds movie, which has done a little bit better than expected, which is a good thing, because it had an exclusive window. So as long as you have an exclusive window, you can do that. I believe the windows are way short right now, because now it's an exclusive window of 45 days. It was bad enough when they switched the theatrical window from 6 months to 3 months, because what used to happen is, with a 6-month window, that was a sufficient amount of time for a movie to be platformed, meaning you open it in certain key cities and on a smaller level and gradually increase the number of theaters it's in. You don't do this for like an Avengers movie, but you certainly do it for a movie like Nomadland, which wins the Academy Award for Best Picture and basically makes no money. So you want to have that ability to platform. If you'd platform Nomadland, there's a good chance it would have probably gone out to $100 million. Now, I happen to not like Nomadland, so I find that unbelievable. But I also didn't like Fried Green Tomatoes, which 30 years ago did exactly that. And so you have that ability. Without that, you're always going to be in trouble. And Warner Brothers, I think, has bet the farm on the wrong horse as far as that's concerned. So the long and short is, AT&T looks at all of that and says, oh my God, what have we done? And they needed to get out of that before the hemorrhaging of disaster got worse. The reason Discovery bought it is because, quite frankly, no one else wanted it. On the other hand, Discovery buying it is probably the best thing that could happen to Warner Brothers long term. I was wrong about when NBC Universal was first bought by Comcast, because it looked daft for a smaller company to buy the larger one. And in fact, there was all sorts of machinations that were done in order to make that happen. Yet, Comcast understood its audience. And if you look at how the studios have survived themselves, outside of the guy who was running the studio for 25 years, deciding to sleep with the wrong person and being Me Too'd out of a job, they've been doing pretty well. They bet their money behind Jason Blum and Blumhouse, the lower budget horror movies, which had phenomenal returns on investment. So Universal is sitting very well because of all of this. Warner Brothers is not. Discovery, being a company that absolutely understands its audience, and they absolutely understand the domestic audience, and they absolutely appreciate the domestic audience. This is the most important part. They know what they have. They're not looking at Bugs Bunny cartoons and Casablanca and all this other stuff and saying, what the hell are we going to do with this old crap? Nobody wants it. They're going to actually look at it and say, you know what? This quote unquote old crap has been generating income for the better part of 100 years. And that means we can still generate income from it. It doesn't all have to be about the latest big tentpole film needing to be big. We understand audience flow. We understand why the CW, in spite of its very comparatively small footprint vis-a-vis the other traditional networks, nevertheless has a very good demographic break. And we like it that way. So I think that there's good potential for Discovery to understand what they have in Warner Media and actually make it work. The second mega merger is, of course, Disney, and when they bought 20th Century Fox. When Disney bought 20th Century Fox, they quite frankly paid way too much for it. 20th Century Fox in 2017 had been valued at approximately $45 billion all in. Disney paid $71 billion for not the whole company. They carved out Fox News, Fox Network. They couldn't take that anyway because it was competitive with other things that they owned, and certain other side business, Fox Sports, because that Disney owning ESPN, it was an anti-competitive thing, and the FCC wouldn't let that happen. But one of the reasons that it seemed like a good idea for Disney to buy Fox is that they would get that studio, which is prime real estate in West LA. Well, guess what else was carved out of the deal? You're right, the land. So Disney paid $71 billion minus the land, minus Fox Network, minus Fox News, all of which were among Fox's greatest properties. Now, true, they now have all the Rodgers and Hammerstein stuff. They've got the Alien stuff. They now own whatever they didn't own of Star Wars, except apparently there's still underlying contracts that prevents the original trilogy from being shown in its original form, whatever. But they now own all of that, and they have the remake rights. What surprised me about that is that Disney has not really done anything with the Fox library. I'm rather thinking that they're going to dump it. They're looking for someone to buy it. Unfortunately, they're kind of in the same position as AT&T was. With the disappointments in earnings that the studios have been having, even with their Class A projects, there aren't a lot of people who are out there right now saying they want to buy in to the entertainment industry in a big way. So they're kind of stuck with it. Further, you'll notice that Disney has been speaking out of both sides of its mouth, because on the one hand, they were saying, we don't want to do physical media anymore. Famous last words. Can we say that vinyl now outsells CDs? Well, of course it would, because it's kind of campy to be a vinyl collector. Hey, I like high-end audio too, so whatever. But when we look at Disney making that kind of statement in a realm where they've been going out there pulling some of their content back or slapping parental advisories on their old cartoons, they clearly are not valuing their legacy holdings perhaps as well as they should. Henceforth, why should we expect that they know what to do with The Gang's All Here, right? Or Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. These are two old 20th Century Fox movies that were big hits, and I understand why younger executives would have no idea what they are. But let's just say that they actually have a lot of assets that they bought, and they just don't know how to monetize them. They canceled the deal with Twilight Time, which is making a fairly nice profit, rebranding their stuff for home video, for Blu-ray. Okay, do you? Disney always does that. But Disney has far more serious problems. For a number of years, Disney has seemed like the miracle child because Bob Iger, who was running the studio, was someone who was strategically focused exclusively. He knew what assets to buy and pay top dollar for, because it wasn't only Fox that he paid top dollar for, he also paid a lot of money for Pixar and Marvel and all the rest. And Lucasfilm, notoriously. So he spent a lot of money to buy these assets, and because of the growth that Netflix seemed to be saying that Hollywood would have, Wall Street responded very positively. But what that focus on strategy covered was the fact that he wasn't necessarily paying attention operationally. And if you look at the individual pieces of Disney, you see all sorts of trouble. You saw Lucasfilm, under the direction of Kathleen Kennedy, take what were some of the prime IPs of all of Hollywood history and absolutely devalue them. Now, I know that's a controversial statement, and there's a lot of people who like the sequel trilogy, and probably 20 years from now, there'll be even more. But the truth is that the sequel trilogy alienated their core fans. And Kathleen Kennedy, following the run of so many Hollywood execs, went out there and said, the Force is female, it's not male. We don't care about our old fans because they're all dying anyway. So screw them. We're only interested in our young fans. So as far as Disney, Galaxy Edge being focused on the original trilogy and prequel characters, forget it. All that we care about is the sequel trilogy characters. Can we say that that's like 10 or 15 just ridiculously irresponsible decisions that she made? And clearly Kathleen Kennedy, despite the fact that she has risen in power through her association with some of the great auteurs of Hollywood from the 70s to the present, has deep resentment toward them and is trying to get revenge. The bottom line, though, is that she is not in the same kind of power position she once was in. It's clear that she's being pushed out the door, whether right away or sometime in the near future. It's clear that she's not being paid attention to. And after the Gina Carano firing from Mandalorian, and the huge backlash that came from that, certainly her decision-making ability is not there. If you listen to a lot of YouTube channels, you will hear her still being touted as this demon woman out to destroy the fandom. It's not. You know, she was just an executive who was allowed to run wild because the big boss was not focused on operations. How do we know that? Because at the same time, Lucasfilm was in trouble, so was ABC. ABC made one crazy decision after the other, starting with canceling Roseanne, which was the #1 show on TV because Roseanne Barr said something that certain people didn't like. Well, did they even focus group test it to see how much of an impact it would have on the show? I'm willing to say that the Roseanne ratings would have gone up if they paid attention to what the numbers were saying about her willingness to just be a complete iconoclast and say what she thought. Doesn't matter what it was. It's the fact that she refused to go along with the established prescribed narrative. But instead, they kicked her off the air and destroyed the #1 show on TV. #1 shows on TV, can we say, do not grow on trees. And ABC already had canceled Last Man Standing for pretty much the same reason. They didn't like Tim Allen, and they were embarrassed by their audience. What's wrong with the thinking at ABC, where you think that an audience is something that you can say we don't like? Of course you like your audience, because your audience brings in numbers, and those numbers make advertisers want to buy spots on your network. It doesn't matter. You got to say, the audience likes this show. we're gonna champion it. So it moves over to Fox, #1 show. Okay, that was a real smart decision. What was happening at Marvel Comics? During this same period, Marvel Comics became controversial because once again, they're trying to rebrand the series away from the core fandom and go toward an audience that doesn't buy comic books. Because they have Twitter followings or they have Twitter people who say, we want you to do this. That's not an audience that pays money. But meanwhile, Marvel has gone from dominating the sale of physical comic books to being an also ran where it's new #1s, and they're doing way too many #1s. That is, #1s are having disappointments in their sales. And that's hurting what they had planned for the future in terms of the Marvel extended universe. All you have to do is look at what's happening with externals and say, okay, there's clearly a challenge for this feature film coming up that's supposed to be the new face of Marvel. And yet the fan enthusiasm for it is middling at best. And this is coming on the heels of Black Widow being, if anything, a disappointment. I'm going to say that the Scarlett Johansson lawsuit, where she's insisting that she wasn't paid properly, which is true, because Disney released the film day and date on their streaming service, charging $30 extra for it. So it's easy to track how much money they had. And they wanted to cut Scarlett Johansson out of that money. Now they're backtracking and saying, no, she was part of that. No, she wasn't. Otherwise, she wouldn't have sued. Come on, get real. And then now they fired her. Can we say that if Disney isn't careful, someone might notice that with Dwayne Johnson, they did renegotiate his contract for Jungle Cruise so that he would get a percentage of that $30 that they're making from the Disney Plus exposure. Plus, he gets his share of the theatrical. So you're dealing with a male star differently from the way you're dealing with a female star. That doesn't look very good in the post-Me Too era, does it? The difference is Bob Chapek is now in charge of Disney. And Bob Chapek, whom most of Hollywood does not like and thinks is a vulgarian, is actually probably the right person for the job because he comes from Disney parks. And if you think about it, even if you don't, Disney parks accounted for $30 million in revenue every day. What does that mean? That means when you have that much money coming in and you have a failure like Han Solo, you can almost justify it by saying, well, that's just 10 days worth of park revenues. That's not that big a deal. I mean, yeah, it's a big deal, but you got 354 other days to make up for it, right? So therefore, you didn't have that much concern because the parks were bringing in so much money. And the beauty about the parks is that as the person who is running Disney, you are in contact with the people who are at the parks every day. You know your audience. So when Bob Chapek took over, he had an understanding of what makes audiences happy. So even though he's not as coddling towards artists as Bob Iger was, and he's not as much a part of the cocktail circuit, he's certainly enough of a presence to, at least fiscally speaking, at least operationally speaking, take some control over the mess that is the Disney moving parks. Now, of course, we've had other controversies with the parks recently in terms of their new admission plans where you're going to be paying for passes like the Lightning Pass where you pay, what, $40 or $50 per person to jump to the front of the line. This is certainly not playing well with the Disney core fans. But whatever the case, it is a move in the right direction. The other thing Bob Chapek is aware of, and this has caused him to be very criticized by Iger, is that he is aware of what a danger China is as an investment partner. Certainly Bob Iger, who had dreams that he would be made the ambassador to China, has been very much thinking that China would be the answer to all of Disney's problems. Because after all, China is a bottomless pit of money, right? And they're completely enthralled by American culture, and therefore they will buy anything from America. And plus, the size of their middle-class population is pretty much the size of the population of the United States and Europe. So basically, you can say screw you to both the US and Europe. And I'm sure that Bob Iger was very, very pleased with that particular mindset, even though he would never dare say it out loud. Let's now talk about what happened with Mulan. Mulan was a movie that I believe, and remember, I'm Asian and I lived in Japan. So I kind of have an awareness of Asian thought patterns, which are not quite the way Americans think they are. And moreover, Americans keep thinking that Asians are still from Pearl S. Buck land, and we are not. So what ended up happening is, I'm sure China lured him in and gave him a lot of money with which to hang himself. And sure enough, what happened with Mulan is a lot of money was spent on a piece of intellectual property that is Chinese. And yet the film version was made using Western style visuals, meaning that the screen orientation goes from left to right rather than right to left. Not that every Asian movie is right to left oriented, but enough of them are. That's why an Ozu movie looks very different from a Kurosawa movie. Let's put it that way. Kurosawa movies tend to be very Western. Ozu movies were very Japanese. And Jackie Chan movies, very Chinese, very right-left oriented in terms of the way the screen action goes. This is why Chinese movies, by the way, and Asian movies, by the way, look different. The other thing is that Asian stories don't necessarily follow three-part dramatic structure. So take that, Bob McKee and Sid Field, and the guy who wrote Save the Cat, and everyone else who says that three-part dramatic structure is part of the human condition. No, it isn't. It's part of the Western tradition. It's not part of the Eastern tradition at all, and that includes India. So therefore, you are talking about more than half the world's population. So, the fact that they tried to take Mulan and fit it in an American type setup, featuring American style production design and all of that, how did anyone think that that was going to really work among Chinese audiences? I think one of the fascinating things is most people in Hollywood, or most Americans, have never seen what it looks like to see your culture reflected by another culture, and see how ridiculously inaccurate it can be. Because when you're watching it and you're part of the culture that's being depicted, every single thing that you get slightly wrong is going to glare. And it's not going to glare in a positive way. It's going to look fakakta. And that's exactly what happened with Mulan. And think about the other movies that were made specifically for China, such as Shang-Chi. When you look at Shang-Chi, you have a movie that, once again, is made by Disney in an attempt to cater to the Chinese audience without looking at what are the standards of male attractiveness in China. And look at what the answer to Disney was when they were expecting China to be very enthusiastic about this. They said, we don't like this movie because the guy's ugly. Now, that's a very crude statement. But in terms of Asian aesthetics, no, he's not a pretty boy. And that was not acknowledged within the script. Maybe if they had bothered to learn what Asians consider good looking or not, this would not have been quite the issue. And yes, Asian culture is very looksist. I mean, Westerners might look at it and think, oh, all the Japanese people look kind of alike and they're kind of goofy. Well, yeah, but their aesthetic is very, very strict. And if you're considered not good looking in a Far East country, yeah, you're at a disadvantage. Surprise, the world is the same all over. It's not just the West that has a beauty fixation. Anyway, so now you have that. Now you have China saying that it's not going to buy a big chunk of Disney's new movies. They are not taking Black Widow either. What's Disney going to do? They have to revert to not looking at China as its big panacea, that it's going to solve all of the problems. This is, in fact, what's going on in all of Hollywood. The China Express is over. So Netflix, thinking that it still had all of China with which to expand its subscriber base, all the other streaming service thinking the same thing, not going to happen. So therefore, you have now a hard limit on the number of new people who are going to be buying streaming. Asia's been underperforming for quite a while, and why people thought that that was going to turn around, I don't know. Europe is kind of underperforming too. Now, this is underperforming according to expectations, and expectations were overly generous. So no, this is just reality crashing in. So now the industry has to figure out how to make money from just predominantly the West. And if you make money out of China, or you make more out of Japan or South Korea than usual, great. But you cannot look at Asia as being somehow 3/4 of your market, so you don't need to worry about the domestic any longer. You're going to have to start worrying about the domestic. And that's a huge challenge for the Disney universe right now, because they weren't expecting for that to happen. Now, moving on to the other studios, they're all having their own variations of this. Sony made the right decision after the years of Ghostbusters 16. They scaled back on their new stuff and started focusing a lot on their game shows, because Sony, next to Fremantle Media, which owns the Goodson Todman Library, remember I worked for there forever, they're the number one. But Sony is making serious money out of Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy in particular. And we all know that Sony's been having a lot of trouble with Jeopardy, trying to find a new host. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the nitty-gritty of that particular thing that's going on. Let's just say that the tempest in a teapot over the choice of who's going to be host and the predilection for people wanting LeVar Burton is a misstep. LeVar Burton is about as wrong for that host as humanly possible. But I think that Sony is probably looking at him and saying he'd be the right host for replacing Pat Sajak for Wheel of Fortune. And you might say, well, why? It's because the audiences between those two shows are very different. Wheel of Fortune is a much bigger hit than Jeopardy. And Jeopardy has a very peculiar niche where you need a host that's kind of generic, but has something about them that's intriguing, so you keep watching them. And the challenge with LeVar Burton and Ryan Bialik is that they're a little bit too strong as personalities for that particular slot. So it's not a matter of Sony saying, oh, well, we're racist. No, they're not. What they're looking at is they're looking at and saying, that's not who our audience is for this show. He fits better potentially in other shows. And same with Bialik, that she can fit better in other shows. She fits Jeopardy really well in LA and New York. But the big audience for most game shows isn't LA or New York, it's flyover country. And not only is it flyover country, but it leans non-Caucasian very heavily, female particularly. So there's a certain kind of person that fits that to a T. And if you look at what happened with Feud, once they bought Steve Harvey in, he was perfect, because Feud is that kind of a campy show where having someone who's larger than life fits really well. And so there's all sorts of things that go into picking a host. I said I wasn't going to go into that, and I did. Looking at the other studios, MGM was just bought by Amazon. And I think Amazon did that for more than just James Bond. Now, they paid a big premium for it, but that's because MGM has a good name still. And that licensing of that name is still going to bring in money perpetually. The actual assets they have are only the movies from the mid-'80s forward. So there's not necessarily all that much in there. And of course, the James Bond franchise. But what does MGM have that other studio entities didn't have? Why did they pick MGM rather than A24 or Legendary? Well, the truth is that MGM has been very, very good at looking at movies and understanding the relationship between how much you pay for the movie and how much will be returned at the box office. They have survived a very long time, even as a mini major, being able to kind of understand that and know where the key investments should be made. Amazon needs that, because even though Amazon has an incredible amount of money, because most of its money doesn't even come from retail, it comes from their cybersecurity, because they handle banks and embassies and all that worldwide. That's where their real money is. The rest is all kind of just window dressing. So they definitely have the money to lose. They just don't want to lose it. But having an MGM there with its infrastructure, with its core of executives and lawyers and all of that, they have people who are financially responsible because they've had to be. So that was actually a smart purchase. And it'll be interesting to see how they move forward in the near future, because I think that marriage can work. It's possible that it won't, but I think it's more likely that it will be okay. Now, finally, let's approach the world of streaming. The world of streaming is about to have a reckoning, and that's okay, because it's been floating on way too much venture capital, which was looking at the rapid growth of Netflix and thinking that that kind of money would be forthcoming from absolutely everyone who was creating content. But what they weren't saying is that there was a bête noire that was in the room. And that is that originally Netflix also had an enormous library of legacy product. And there were a lot of people who had Netflix just so they could watch reruns of Friends and Seinfeld and other shows. Well, now that a lot of that stuff is migrated back to its home studio, Netflix doesn't have it. So rather than existing on old libraries, it is having to, or having the foundation of old libraries, it is having to have its foundation being all new material. So it is creating all new shows. And they've gotten used to spending too much money because they're doing the Carolco thing, where the way you get the industry to take you seriously is to pay more than a particular product is worth. And by that means everyone will start giving you the A projects and you can move forward. This worked really well with House of Cards until Kevin Spacey got Me Too for being a creep. And now that's a dead asset. But one of the problems with Netflix is that with streaming, you have no second chance. One of the beauties of running a show with one episode a week is that if it starts to go off the rails, your market research will catch it. And that means that before the next episode airs, you might be able to make a couple of changes and pull away from a disaster that's happening, or at least ameliorate it a little bit. For 2 episodes out, you now have enough time to reshoot a substantial amount of the show and have it still make delivery. And that way you can really start making the repair on whatever area was problematic. By the time you get to the 3rd episode, if you need to reshoot 3/4 of it, or maybe even the whole thing, you can do it. So you can fix something before it becomes really serious. With Netflix, once something drops all at once, if people don't like the episode, there's nothing you can do with it. And out of your average season of 10 episodes, the drop off between episode 1 and episode 3, if the show does not become a water cooler moment show where everybody's excited about it and everyone's talking about it, that's where people give up. So you will have 10 episodes, let's say, in a season, which is a very low number. You have 10 episodes where about 80% of your audience is gone by episode 3. So that means that all those back episodes are kind of lost investment capital. Why? Because that show's not going to be talked about. You're not going to have people 2 or 3 years from now still watching it. You're not going to be having subscribers subscribing to the service simply so that they can catch that next season when it comes up. And this is where that number of episodes becomes serious. You need that traditional number of 22 to be able to have an audience there at least for half the year, so that they can become very bonded with the show. And when you watch something as a binge in 2 or 3 days, and then you have to wait 1.5 to 2 years for the next series of episodes, there's plenty of time for you to find something else that's more interesting to you. So that's an unspoken danger. Netflix has what, 600 shows on the in their library at any given time. How many of those shows can you name, and how many of them can you watch? And yes, it's nice to see stuff that's been imported from Europe. What percentage of Americans are watching it? And plus, in Europe, you have another challenge, and that is World War II is not forgotten. And what do I mean by World War II not being forgotten? I mean that if you're in France, you'll watch an American show or British show dubbed in French. But for some reason, a German show dubbed in French, you're not interested in it. And you might say, oh, well, that's because it's dubbed in not. Forget it. Most television internationally is dubbed. And there's a reason for that. Because even, until fairly recently, most shows didn't have live sound. Most movies didn't have live sound. Fictional ones. You would go in there and dub them after the fact. When you see a Fellini movie, most of them were shot basically silent, and according to legend, with people counting and then having the dialogue fit in around their mouths counting. So they're dubbed no matter what language you're watching them in. America and the English-speaking territories have always been lucky because they don't have to do that. So when you're looking at vernacular programming, everyday programs, not the special ones, not the ones that are going to be award winners, but your average everyday show, you still have cultural boundaries. You still have Italians not necessarily watching every single French drama or every single German drama. You don't have Spain watching German and French and dramas either. About the only shows that really cross territories are ones that originated in English. So, and that's because Hollywood was so dominant for so many years. And this is something that remains a challenge, because a lot of times what Netflix will do is they'll make a deal in, let's say, France or Germany to do a show as a co-venture. But then that show is not a Netflix show in that territory. It becomes one that the local one of the local services will own. And that turns around and means that you've created something that will maybe work somewhat in the US and maybe somewhat in other European countries, but it's not necessarily going to be appointment viewing. And this has been something that has hurt Netflix seriously because it's spending a lot of money on shows that don't necessarily bring in new subscribers. And that's the goal of every single show. The goal of every single show on a Netflix or an HBO Max or a Peacock has to be either viewer retention or new viewer engagement. And that isn't happening in anywhere near the numbers it needs to. Now, if you're a company that has an economic backing, such as a Sony, such as an Apple or something like that, doesn't matter. But with Amazon, but with Netflix, it has to make it on what it has in-house. And this is why this is a challenge right now. So there's a lot of issues that are going on in the industry. And the last thing that I want to discuss is why, despite the fact that I'm saying stuff that sounds negative, why I think the industry is poised for a renaissance. First of all, we're repeating exactly models that have happened in the past. The 1950s when television first came in. The 1970s when you had all of the studios crashing out with the big musicals, and then getting resurrected with things like MASH, and then of course with the George Lucas and Steven Spielberg's coming in. So there's always a silver lining to every single cloud, and I think that that's going to come from shows that are very localized and movies that are very localized. And what do I mean by localized? I mean that they become more culturally specific. We've spent a lot of time trying to make movies and TV shows that appeal worldwide. I think what we're going to have to do is scale back on budgets and do things for less money. And in the process of doing those things for less money, we'll be able to create that kind of a renaissance that we had in the 1970s, where you suddenly had major filmmakers emerge out of nowhere, simply because they had a passion for it and they connected with their core audience first. And from connecting with that core audience, they expanded outwards. And when you do it that way, then you can be a lot more innovative and a lot more thoughtful about what it is you're doing. And that is why I still have hope for Hollywood. And that is why I still love the business. And I think that's why we do all love the movies and TV, isn't it? Because they're constantly changing. And variety is the spice of life.
I got whatever Lola wants.